The gender wage gap. 4 seemingly simple words. 4 words thrown about so often by the media and between politicians. How much do you actually know about it? A common misconception is that the gender wage gap is the difference in pay between a man and a woman doing the same job. This is not true. Being paid differently for doing the same job purely based on your gender is illegal. The gender wage gap is actually the difference in earnings between all men and all women across all jobs. As of 2019, the gender wage gap in hourly earnings meant that women typically earned around a fifth less than men. To put this another way, looking at hourly earnings, if a typical man in the working population is earning £100, then a typical woman in comparison would be earning £82. When we look at the gender wage gap, we look at the gap in hourly earnings as opposed to weekly earnings. This allows us to compare like for like. For example, in general, women tend to spend fewer hours in paid work than men. Therefore, if we compared weekly earnings, there would be larger differences as women in general work fewer hours. This is why looking at hourly earnings allows us to compare like for like between men and women. If we look back 20 years, the differences in earnings was larger than it is today, showing that the gap is falling. The male icon represents your typical man, and the female icon represents your typical woman. There are 2 key reasons as to why the gender wage gap has fallen. Number 1, women have experienced a more rapid increase in their education levels in the last 20 years compared to men. Better education tends to mean higher paid jobs, and so the gap in wages between men and women narrows. The second is that the wage gap among low-educated individuals has fallen over the last 2 decades. Combined, these 2 observations have led to a narrowing of the gender wage gap. However, it would be misleading to say that one figure of the gender wage gap is the same for all men and all women. If we break the gender wage gap down, it becomes clear that different groups experience different wage gaps. On the horizontal axis of this graph, we have grouped people based on certain characteristics. As we move from the darkest blue bar to the lightest blue bar, we add what we call a different control. You can think of this as adding a characteristic. The vertical axis shows the corresponding gender wage gap. By adding different controls, the gender wage gap gets larger or smaller. The lightest blue bar on the far right is the smallest. This means that the gap in wages between men and women is the smallest for those who work more than 20 hours, don't have children, and are young. The largest difference in the bars of the chart is between those with and without children, the middle 2 bars. This would suggest that having a child has an effect on the gender wage gap. But why is this? To understand why childbirth has such an effect on the gender wage gap, we need to understand key reasons behind the gap itself. To do this, we'll go back to the basics. Wages are determined by 2 key factors, experience and education. The more educated you are or the more experience you have, the higher your wage is likely to be, and vice versa. Therefore, anything that influences one of these factors, experience and education, could be driving increases in the gender wage gap. Now, going back to my previous question, why is there the biggest difference in the gender wage gap between those with and without children? Well, we have to look at how childbirth affects the components of wage. Of the 2, experience and education, becoming a parent has the largest impact on experience. When we use the word experience, we mean work experience. This is gained while on the job. It is specific knowledge acquired through working in the same sector or workplace for a number of years. For example, specific legal knowledge about the financial sector, known only to those who work in the sector. I'm now going to introduce Sally. Sally represents a typical woman in the working population. She has a reasonable education and has been working for 10 years. Sally has a job which pays her what we would regard as a very typical salary. She neither has Bill Gates sort of money, nor does she have no money at all. Sally is very what we would call average. Becoming a parent has meant that Sally has made some important decisions when it comes to her childcare responsibilities. Childcare responsibilities range from supervision and entertaining to bathing and feeding. Sally will be the parent taking on the majority of the childcare. She doesn't have enough money to pay for a childminder, and if she returns to work, she wants to be close by in case of emergencies. From Sally, we can establish two key changes due to parenthood. Number one, Sally now wants more flexibility in her work hours, and number two, she doesn't want to commute as far as she previously did. These effects create a mismatch between the skills that Sally has and the jobs available to her. By looking at each one in turn, we can see how they have an effect on the gender wage gap. Starting with number one, Sally requires more flexibility in her work hours. Even after maternity leave is up, young children require a lot of care and attention. Previously, Sally had worked what we would call a 9-to-5 day, very normal hours for a large number of the working population. Now she has had a child, she doesn't want to commit to working for a solid 8 hours a day. Although flexible working hours are becoming more common in work practices around the world, it is not something that you see in every job. If Sally wants to find a job that allows her to have flexible working hours so she can work around her childcare responsibilities, she may have to accept a job which doesn't particularly match her skill set, or even accept lower pay in order for the flexibility. To illustrate this idea, let's assume that before childbirth Sally was a teacher. She had to work hours in line with the school day. Now she has had a child, she doesn't want to work these hours anymore. She still has the skill set of the teacher, but isn't able to practice teaching due to the work hours. Sally wants to find a job with more flexible hours. She finds one at a local supermarket, where she can choose her hours around her availability. There is now a mismatch between the skills Sally has as a teacher and the job she is doing as a supermarket worker. This may mean two things. Either Sally may now be accepting a lower wage as a supermarket worker than a teacher, or Sally may decide that her skills aren't being used as well as they could be, and so there isn't much reason to return to work at all. So she stays out of paid employment completely. Both accepting a lower wage and staying out of paid employment drive an increase in the gender wage gap. Now we can turn to look at the second effect that new childcare responsibilities have. This is that Sally doesn't want to commute as far as she previously did. Reducing commuting distance leads to fewer job opportunities. The decision behind reducing commuting time is a personal one, but it is one taken by a lot of mothers who want to be closer to their child and can't afford childcare. Let's assume that prior to childbirth, Sally could commute for around 30 minutes to work. After childbirth, she only wants to commute for around 15. The example highlighted here is a very simple one. Because Sally has halved her commuting time, she has halved the job opportunities available to her. This is known as reducing the pool of jobs to choose from. To put this in a more visual way, imagine that Sally has a swimming pool and a paddling pool. The swimming pool represents the jobs available to her if she commutes for a longer period of time, and the paddling pool represents the jobs available to Sally if she has a shorter commute. Clearly, the swimming pool is larger than the paddling pool. Hence, if Sally was willing to commute for a longer amount of time, she would have a larger pool of job opportunities. A smaller pool of job opportunities may mean that Sally accepts a lower wage than she previously had, or she may decide her skills aren't being used as well as they could be and exits the workforce completely. Both accepting a lower wage and staying out of paid employment drive an increase in the gender wage gap. One thing to mention here is that the example of Sally is not the case for every woman. Some women decide to stay out of paid work after having a child on their own accord. They may be financially supported by a partner and therefore can afford not to work. Others may have enough money to pay to have someone else to look after their child while they are at work, and so there's less responsibility on themselves. Sally represents a typical woman, not every woman. So, is there anything that can be done about the gender wage gap? It should be mentioned here that we have looked at increases in the gender wage gap after childbirth. There is still a substantial gap prior to childbirth, and the reasons behind this are far less understood. The most direct way to try and reduce the effect of childbirth on the gender wage gap is through government policy. The Oxford Dictionary definition of a policy is a plan of action. Policies could include childcare support or trying to get more firms to introduce flexible working hours. They should aim to encourage mothers like Sally to return to the same high-quality jobs they had before becoming parents, and not to settle for a career that doesn't match their skill set. Sally has highlighted the clashes that parenthood could create with work hour flexibility and job opportunities, and how these in turn affect the gender wage gap. So, if asked where we stand on closing the gender wage gap, the answer would be, we're not quite there yet.